On the afternoon of Thursday 29th June 1871, Fanny McBride was making her way across the hall of the Northern Bank on the corner of Main Street in Newton Stewart in County Tyrone in Northern Ireland. She worked as a maid for the bank manager and had come down the stairs to check the bank's clock. However, she noticed blood coming from under an outer office door and raised the alarm. Then the body of 25-year-old William Glass was found lying on the floor in a pool of blood. He'd been beaten to death, his head having deep cuts, but what was gruesome was that the sharp-pointed copper file had been forced through his head from ear to ear. The safe in the office was wide open, and it was soon discovered £1,600 in gold and cash had been stolen. The police were called, and leading the investigation was 29-year-old District Inspector Thomas Hartley Montgomery. After he inspected the scene, he suggested that Glass had in fact taken his own life, but the injuries inflicted told a different story, and a police investigation got underway. Montgomery had the body removed from the scene and, against protocol, failed to inform all the local stations of the murder. He instead telegraphed District Inspector William Purcell in Omagh, the neighbouring district, asking him to please inform the coroner that a death under suspicious circumstances has occurred, and I request his attendance as soon as possible here. Montgomery then went on to send a message by train to police headquarters, reporting that William Glass, bank cashier, murdered, and large sum of money stolen. Please examine trains and lodging houses. At around midnight, Montgomery told his officers that he was heading home for a few hours' sleep, but instead he made his way to a wooded area known as Grange Wood, just outside Newton Stewart. At 2 o'clock in the morning, he met Inspector Purcell, coming from Omagh, telling him that he was keeping an eye on the railway in case strikers caused any damage. As the two walked into town, they discussed the murder, and he asked Purcell, could the last person coming out of the bank be convicted if he had no blood on his clothes? Purcell said he thought not. In fact, Montgomery was the last person seen coming out of the bank, and a few days later was charged with the murder of his friend, Glass. Several witnesses had seen him near the bank at the time of the murder, and it transpired he was short of money. 6 months later, the murder weapon and the money was found by a boy who was hunting rabbits with his dog in Grange Wood. The rain had washed away the soil under the large stone where it had been hidden, and some of the banknotes were exposed. £1,500 in cash was discovered, and £30 in gold. Not far away from the money was a bill hook, heavily weighted with lead. This turned out to be the murder weapon. Montgomery stood trial in Omagh on 17th July 1872 before Mr. Justice Lawson. The Crown prosecution case put forward that he'd waited until the day the bank manager, Mr. J.G. Strahan, had been at the sub-branch at Drumquin for the weekly fair, then had attacked and murdered Glass, then stolen the money. Montgomery was a close friend of Glass and a regular visitor to the bank, and was paving the way for Glass to join the police force. Strahan and his family were on holiday, leaving just his aunt, Miss Thompson, the maid, Fanny McBride, and the gardener, Robert Cook, at the bank. At around 2:30 p.m. on the day of the murder, Montgomery had gone to the flat above the bank where Strahan lived and the door was answered by Miss Thompson. He asked if Stan wanted to go fishing, but she told him he wouldn't be back until 6 o'clock, so he left. Shortly before this, someone had heard Glass speaking to someone in his office, with the bank closing at 3 o'clock. At around 3:30, Montgomery was seen leaving the bank by several people, but only 3 testified in court. Mrs. Mary Ann Cameron fainted during cross-examination. Mrs. Harriet McDowell ran a shop directly opposite the bank with her husband, James. She was adamant that Montgomery had left the bank at 3:20 p.m, closing the door behind him. She described what he was wearing as a round hat and dark clothes, with a waterproof coat slung over his arm. He also had a stick in one hand. James McDowell corroborated his wife's story and said he'd sold him a few pounds of lead previously. He said Montgomery told him he wanted to make bullets with the lead, but following a search of Mr. McClenachan's house where Montgomery lodged, no mould or lead was found. It had solely been used to weight the billhook. A police officer testified that once Montgomery had mentioned how strange it was no one had tried to rob a bank, stating how easy it would be to clobber the cashier and steal the money. Montgomery had mentioned something similar to Strawn, asking him how he would deal with it, and he promptly produced the pistol. During the trial, the judge refused to allow the jury to hear of Montgomery's dire financial position, which was certainly a motive for murder. This left the defence telling the jury that no motive had been proven by the prosecution. Of the jury of 12, 9 voted to convict him, while 3 believed he should be acquitted. As a result, a retrial was ordered. During the second trial in March 1873 before Mr. Justice Barry, Montgomery's financial affairs were admitted. He had huge debts, owing a great deal to his father-in-law, and had embezzled a few £100 from his constables, who he told he was investing it for them. However, the prosecution again managed to divide the jurors, with 2 of them voting for acquittal. They asked how he'd managed to conceal so much money and the weapon in broad daylight. The case went to a 3rd trial. This trial took place on 21st July 1873 before Mr. Justice Barry. This time he wasn't going to get away with it. The prosecution asked a police officer of the same size and build to wear the clothes that Montgomery had worn on the day of the murder, and was asked to conceal the money and the murder weapon. He stood on a table so the jury could see him clearly, and he moved around in the clothes freely. They were stunned that it was all hidden so well. The officer was asked to produce the money for clarity, and he laid it all on the table, along with the billhook. Montgomery was finally found guilty of the murder of Glass. He tried to claim insanity, that his father-in-law had drugged and poisoned him the year before the crime, and that he'd been foolish gambling the money away. He fooled no one, and the death sentence was passed. He confessed that by the time he'd seen Miss Thompson, the murder and robbery had already taken place, and the money and murder weapon was concealed on his person. He'd hidden his bloodied hands in his pockets, and had managed to wipe blood off his coat and trousers with a sponge. Inspector Thomas Hartley Montgomery was hanged at Omagh Jail on Tuesday 26 August 1873, It said his last words to the executioner were, "Is hanging painful?" The wooden counter where Glass's blood had stained it was removed and placed in a glass case in the bank, and when it closed in June 2012, it was saved and is now housed in a pub in Drumquin.